nicknamed the Deacon of Death.
Sammy, did you do it? Confess?
Samuel Smithers was a deacon at a Plant City church back in 1996 when he murdered Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. Investigators said he paid both women for sex, then dumped their bodies in a Plant City pond. Smithers was sentenced to death in 1999 and has been sitting on death row for nearly 30 years. Now, at 72, he is set to die by lethal injection.
On October 14, 2025, in the state of Florida, the long-delayed execution of Samuel Lee Smithers finally took place inside Florida State Prison. A man, once known in his community as a humble church deacon, was put to death by lethal injection, closing the book on one of the most haunting double murder cases in Florida's history. For nearly 30 years, Smithers had lived behind bars, carrying the title, the Deacon of Death, a nickname born from the shocking truth that this seemingly religious man had brutally killed 2 women and dumped their bodies in a pond behind his home. Tonight, we retrace the twisted story of a man who preached faith by day and hid darkness by night, and how justice finally caught up with him 3 decades later. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling rise and fall of Samuel Lee Smithers and the night Florida's quiet deacon met his final judgment. To understand how a man once seen as a figure of faith could become one of Florida's most chilling killers, we have to look back at the quiet life of Samuel Lee Smithers. Born in 1956, Smithers grew up in Hillsborough County, Florida, surrounded by modest southern neighborhoods and the deep rhythms of church life. He was the kind of man people called steady. Married, dependable, the one who opened the chapel doors before sunrise every Sunday. For decades, he worked as a groundskeeper and handyman, maintaining yards and fixing fences for neighbors who trusted him completely. By all appearances, Smithers lived a simple, faithful life. He served as a deacon at the East Lake United Methodist Church, the man who prayed for others, volunteered for the needy, and read scripture in front of the congregation. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker had taken root, a loneliness mixed with guilt, desire, and frustration. He began drinking heavily, often disappearing from home for hours. People noticed his temper change, but no one imagined what he was truly capable of. By the mid-1990s, cracks in his perfect image began to show. He had mounting debts, marital strain, and a growing habit of visiting parts of town he never mentioned at church. And then, in May 1996, that double life finally surfaced, in the most horrifying way possible. Because that spring, the man who once led Sunday prayers would become the focus of one of Florida's most disturbing murder investigations. It was May 16, 1996, when a storm hit Plant City, Florida, the kind of humid, heavy evening when the air itself feels uneasy. That same night, Samuel Lee Smithers, the trusted church deacon, lured a woman named Denise Huber, a local sex worker, to a property where he worked as a caretaker. What happened next would shatter the illusion of who he really was. Investigators later said that Smithers attacked Denise in a violent rage, striking her repeatedly and then dragging her lifeless body to a small pond behind the house. He used a hammer to weigh her down before submerging her underwater. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 28th, he did it again. Another woman, Vicky Pfeiffer, who lived a troubled life on the streets, vanished without a trace. When police began searching for her, all roads led back to the same quiet man who claimed to just help people in need. When detectives arrived at Smithers' home, his demeanor was calm, almost polite. But their search revealed something horrifying. Both women's bodies were found submerged in the same pond behind his property. Each had suffered blunt force trauma, and evidence showed they had been killed at different times. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the brutality. It was the cold precision. This wasn't a random act of violence. Smithers had cleaned the area, hidden the murder weapon, and continued his daily church duties as if nothing had happened. Neighbors later told police they saw him mowing lawns and greeting people at church just days after the murders. The same man who had led Sunday prayers now, concealing 2 bodies in his backyard pond. The quiet deacon had turned into something else entirely. And when confronted with the evidence, his entire double life, his faith, his lies, and his crimes began to unravel. The discovery of the two bodies in the pond behind Samuel Lee Smithers' home turned a local missing persons case into one of Florida's most shocking murder investigations. Within hours, detectives sealed off the area, treating the peaceful property like a battlefield of hidden secrets. Crime scene divers described the water as dark and heavy, filled with debris and the faint shimmer of metallic fragments. When they surfaced, they carried with them a hammer, the same one Smithers had used in his job as a groundskeeper. Forensic tests later revealed the woman's blood and tissue on its head. Investigators quickly pieced together a chilling pattern. Both victims had been lured under the pretense of help, attacked in the same isolated location, and disposed of in the same pond. Every detail pointed to one man, the church deacon who lived just yards away. When police brought Smithers in for questioning, he denied everything. He claimed the women had attacked him first, insisting the deaths were accidents. But his calm, almost rehearsed answers didn't convince anyone. Detectives noticed scratches on his arms, bruising around his wrists, and mud still under his fingernails, the kind that came from wading into the pond. Then came the breaking point. Confronted with the forensic evidence, the hammer, the matching footprints, and the autopsy results, Smithers finally confessed. He admitted to killing both women, saying he had been overwhelmed and lost control. Yet what struck investigators most was his tone. No tears, no panic, just a man quietly describing two brutal murders as if recounting a routine mistake. When news of his arrest reached the East Lake United Methodist Church, disbelief turned into shock. Parishioners who once prayed beside him struggled to understand how the man who read scripture on Sundays could commit such violence. One member said, "He was the last person we'd ever suspect, the one who told us to love our neighbors, but the evidence told a different story, one of deceit, rage, and the terrifying double life of a man who preached forgiveness while hiding murder." By 1998, the case of State of Florida versus Samuel Lee Smithers had become front-page news. The story of a church deacon turned double murderer gripped the state, not just for its brutality, but for the shocking contrast between his faith and his crimes. When Smithers entered the courtroom, the same calm expression he wore during interrogation was still there. He stood quietly as the prosecution detailed how he had used his position of trust to mask a darker side, one capable of unimaginable violence. The state argued that Smithers was not a man who lost control, but one who deliberately targeted vulnerable women and disposed of them with chilling precision. In front of the jury, prosecutors laid out every piece of evidence: the hammer, the pond, the confession, and the forensic reports. They described how he carried on with daily life as if nothing had happened, mowing lawns and attending church while two bodies lay in the water behind his home. Each detail painted a picture of cold calculation rather than momentary rage. His defense team tried to sway the jury with a plea for mercy. They pointed to his years of church service, his clean record, and his supposed mental instability. They argued that he wasn't a monster, just a man who snapped under pressure. But the evidence, and his lack of remorse, drowned out every word. Witnesses described his demeanor during the trial as emotionless. He rarely looked at the families of the victims, never apologized, and seemed detached from the horror of his own actions. When the prosecution showed photos of the crime scene, jurors were visibly shaken, some even wiping away tears. After days of testimony and only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge's voice was steady as he delivered the sentence: death by lethal injection. In that moment, the courtroom fell silent. For the families of Denise Huber and Vicky Pfeiffer, justice had finally spoken. But for those who once prayed beside him in church, it was a moment of disbelief, watching the same man who once preached forgiveness now condemned to die. Smithers showed no visible emotion. He simply nodded, turned to the bailiff, and walked out, escorted toward a cell that would hold him for nearly 3 decades, as he awaited the day Florida carried out his sentence. After his conviction, Samuel Lee Smithers was transferred to Florida's death row at Union Correctional Institution. a place reserved for the state's most notorious offenders. There, in a narrow concrete cell, he spent the next 27 years waiting for justice to run its course. Over the decades, his lawyers filed multiple appeals, citing mental illness, age, and claims of improper jury instructions. But each time, the courts rejected his arguments. Judges wrote that Smithers' crimes were cold, calculated, and premeditated, the kind of acts that met every legal standard for the death penalty. During his years behind bars, Smithers often wrote letters to his church and family, claiming he had found peace through God. He read scripture daily, occasionally meeting with prison chaplains, but never reached out directly to the victims' families. To them, his silence said everything. By 2025, all legal options were exhausted. The Florida Supreme Court set his execution date for October 14, 2025, marking the 14th execution carried out in the state that year, a record number under Governor Ron DeSantis. On the morning of his execution, witnesses described Smithers as calm, almost resigned. He declined a special last meal, accepting only the standard prison tray. At 6:05 p.m., he was escorted to the death chamber at Florida State Prison, where the cold, fluorescent lights reflected off the sterile white walls. Reporters noted that he looked older, gray hair, sunken eyes, and a faint tremor in his hands. When asked for his final statement, Smithers looked toward the glass where witnesses sat and spoke softly. "To the families of the women I hurt, I'm sorry. I wish I could take it back. I pray you find peace." At 6:13 p.m., the warden gave the signal. A clear chemical flowed through the tubes connected to his arm. Within minutes, Smithers took his final breath. He was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m., ending nearly 3 decades of appeals and silence. For some, it was a long-awaited moment of closure. For others, it was a grim reminder that justice, even when it comes, can never undo the pain left behind. As the curtain closed on the life of Samuel Lee Smithers, Florida marked yet another chapter in its long history of capital punishment. But beyond the sterile walls of the execution chamber, his story left behind far more than a record number. It left questions that no one can easily answer. How does a man go from preaching compassion to committing such unspeakable acts? How can someone so trusted, so familiar, hide a darkness so complete? Smithers' death brought closure to some, but peace to few. For the families of Denise Huber and Vicky Pfeiffer, the execution ended a wait that had lasted nearly 3 decades. Yet no sentence, no final apology could bring their loved ones back. His final words, soft and remorseful, echoed a contradiction that defined his life: a man of faith destroyed by sin, a voice of prayer silenced by violence. In the end, Samuel Lee Smithers' name stands as a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes, it wears the mask of the righteous. As viewers, we're left to wonder, can true redemption exist after such darkness? And does justice after all these years ever feel complete? This was the story of Samuel Lee Smithers, the deacon who hid death behind devotion. If you believe every story, no matter how dark, holds a lesson about truth and justice. Stay with us for more cases that uncover the final hours before the end.